He saw her in the water, and by sundown, the silence of the valley had turned against him. The creek ran narrow through the red earth, no more than 10 feet across, where the stones broke the current into silver ribbons, the kind of place a man rode past without thinking unless his throat was dry or his horse was near spent. And Ethan Cole had both problems that afternoon: dust clinging to his coat, the late sun hanging low enough to turn everything gold and sharp at the edges, the air still except for the slow murmur of water moving over rock. He dismounted without a sound, boots sinking slightly into the damp bank, his horse lowering its head to drink while he knelt, cupping water in his hands, letting it run through his fingers once before bringing it to his mouth. Cold enough to wake something in his chest he hadn't felt in a long time. Something like peace, something like forgetting. That was when he heard it. Not a voice, not a warning, just the shift of water where it shouldn't shift, a ripple that didn't belong to the current. And when he looked up, he saw her. She stood on the far side of the creek, half shadow, half light, still as the canyon walls, her dark hair falling over her shoulders, her posture straight in a way that didn't belong to fear or surprise, but to something older, something practiced. And for one suspended second neither of them moved. Not even the wind dared pass between them, and Ethan felt it before he understood it, that he had crossed into a moment that wasn't his to witness. He looked away first, slow, deliberate, lowering his gaze to the water as if that could undo what had already happened, as if respect could travel backward through time. But the silence had changed. It had weight now, pressing against his shoulders, settling into the ground beneath his boots. He stood, stepping back, hands open at his sides, not reaching, not speaking, the way his mother had once told him to stand when a storm rolled in without warning. Don't fight it. Don't challenge it. Just let it pass if it chooses to pass. When he finally dared to glance up again, she was gone, not a sound left behind, not a ripple to mark where she had been, only the steady movement of the creek as if it had swallowed the moment whole and refused to give it back. Ethan exhaled slowly, tension he hadn't named slipping from his chest, and he told himself it was nothing, just a stranger startled at the water's edge, just a mistake carried away by the current. But the valley didn't agree. The birds that had been calling moments before fell quiet. The air thickened in a way he couldn't explain, and even his horse lifted its head, ears turning toward the ridge as if listening for something far off and coming closer. Ethan gathered the reins, mounting without hurry, but he didn't drink again, didn't look back at the creek, because some part of him understood that whatever he had seen, whatever boundary he had crossed without knowing, it wasn't finished with him yet. And as he rode away, the fading light stretched his shadow long across the ground, a lone figure moving through a land that had just begun to notice him. And somewhere beyond the ridge, unseen and unheard, the first watchful eyes were already turning in his direction. By the time Ethan Cole reached his cabin, the light had thinned into that quiet gray that settled over the land just before night claimed it fully, the kind of hour when even the wind seemed to hold its breath. And yet nothing about the evening felt the same as it had that morning. Nothing felt ordinary anymore. His cabin stood alone on a stretch of dry ground half a mile from the creek, built from rough timber and stubborn patience, its porch sagging slightly on one side where the earth had shifted over the years, and the familiar sight of it should have brought him ease, should have told him that whatever had happened at the water was already behind him, but it did not. He dismounted slowly, boots hitting the dirt with a dull weight, his horse lingering closer than usual, as if reluctant to be left alone, and Ethan paused there for a moment, one hand resting on the saddle, eyes scanning the horizon in a way he had not done in years. 7 years he had lived out here, far enough from town to be forgotten, far enough from trouble to let it pass him by, and in all that time, the land had been predictable in its silence, honest in its dangers, but tonight it felt like something unseen had shifted just beneath the surface, like the rules he had come to trust no longer held the same shape. He led the horse to the post, tied it off, and stepped onto the porch, the wood creaking under his weight, every sound sharper than it should have been, as if the quiet itself was listening back. Inside, the cabin held the faint scent of leather and smoke, the simple order of a life kept small on purpose, a table, a cot, a stove, nothing more than a man needed when he had chosen to need very little, and Ethan moved through it by habit, setting down his hat, pouring water into a tin cup, But even the act felt distant, like he was watching himself from somewhere, just behind his own eyes. He stopped near the doorway when he noticed it, something that did not belong, something that had not been there when he left that morning. It lay just at the edge of the porch, where shadow met the last trace of light, a small object, easy to miss if a man was not looking for it, and yet impossible to ignore once seen. Ethan stepped back outside, slow, measured, his hand hovering near his side, but not reaching for anything. Not yet, because instinct told him this was not the kind of moment that welcomed sudden moves. The object was a cord, thin and worn, with a small piece of stone tied at its center, smooth and dark with a faint line of color running through it like a river caught in rock, and he knew without needing to be told that it had not fallen there by accident. He crouched, studying it without touching, the air around him pressing closer, the silence deepening until he could hear his own breath, steady but heavier than before. A sign, he thought, though he did not yet know of what, and the realization settled into him the same way the dusk settled over the land, quiet, unavoidable, final. Somewhere beyond the ridge, something had seen him, had followed him without a sound, had come close enough to leave this and then vanish again without a trace, and that meant one thing he could not ignore. Whatever had begun at the creek had not ended when he rode away. It had only just found its path to his door. The night did not settle the way it used to. It did not stretch wide and empty like a promise of rest. It pressed in close, heavy and watchful, and Ethan Cole felt at the moment the last line of light slipped behind the ridge and the sky turned the deep color of cooled iron. He did not light the lantern right away, not out of caution alone, but because something in him resisted breaking the dark, as if fire would only make him easier to find. And instead he sat just inside the doorway, the small stone cord still lying where he had left it on the porch, close enough to see, far enough not to touch. The sounds of the land shifted one by one, insects quieting, the distant call of a night bird cutting short, even the wind pulling back until the air stood still, and in that stillness, Ethan noticed something else, something that did not belong to the rhythm he had come to know over 7 long years. Footsteps would have been easier, a snapped twig, a horse shifting weight, something a man could measure and understand, but this was not that. This was presence without sound, the kind that moved between shadows and stayed just outside the edge of sight, and it settled into him slowly, the certainty that he was no longer alone, not in the way he had chosen, but in a way that had chosen him. He leaned forward slightly, eyes fixed on the dark stretch beyond the porch, his breathing steady, his hands empty and visible, not reaching for anything, not even the rifle resting against the wall behind him, because whatever waited out there had already proven it could come close without being seen, and force would only turn silence into something worse. Minutes passed, or maybe longer, time losing its shape in the quiet, until the faintest movement broke against the edge of the night. Not a step, not a shift, just the suggestion of form where there had been none, and then she was there. Not approaching, not retreating, simply standing where the darkness met the open ground, her figure outlined by the pale wash of starlight, still as she had been by the creek, as if the world moved around her and she remained unchanged. Ethan did not speak at first, because he understood now that words were not the language of this moment, that whatever had passed between them earlier did not need explanation to exist, and yet the weight of it pressed forward, asking for something to be given in return. He rose slowly, careful in every movement, and stepped out onto the porch, stopping a few feet from the edge, leaving space between them as if space itself carried meaning. She did not move closer, did not turn away, and for a long moment they stood like that, 2 figures held in the same stretch of silence, neither claiming it, neither breaking it. Then, with a motion so small it could have been missed, she lifted her hand, not in threat, not in greeting, but in acknowledgement, and her voice came after, quiet, steady, carrying across the distance without effort. "You should not have seen," she said, and the words did not accuse, did not ask, they simply placed a truth between them that could not be taken back. Ethan held her gaze, the same steady look he had carried through storms and long winters, and he answered just as quietly, "I know, because there was nothing else to offer that would not make it worse." The silence returned, deeper now, but no longer empty, and in that silence something shifted, not in the land, not in the night. But between them, something fragile and unspoken that neither of them fully understood yet, but both of them felt, as certain as the ground beneath their feet, and as uncertain as what would come when the sun rose again. The words settled between them like dust after a long ride, quiet but impossible to ignore, and Ethan Cole felt the weight of them linger in the air long after her voice faded, not as a threat, not as an accusation, but as something older, something that carried meaning he did not yet fully understand. He shifted his stance slightly, not stepping closer, not retreating, his hands still open at his sides, because instinct told him that movement mattered now more than ever, that even the smallest gesture could tip whatever fragile balance held this moment together. The night pressed in around them, cool and still, the faint scent of dry earth and distant sage drifting through the air, and somewhere far off a coyote called once, before falling silent again, as if even the wild things knew to leave this space untouched. She lowered her hand slowly, the motion controlled, deliberate, and took a single step forward, stopping well short of the porch, keeping the same careful distance he had chosen, and in that mirrored restraint there was something like understanding, though neither of them spoke it aloud. "You left," she said after a moment, her voice steady, carrying easily across the space between them, not raised, not softened, simply certain. Ethan gave a small nod, the movement barely more than a shift of shadow across his face, because it was true, because leaving had been the only thing he knew to do. "I did," he answered, his voice low, even, shaped by years of speaking only when words were needed. Her gaze held his, unwavering, searching not for apology but for something else, something deeper than regret, and when she spoke again, there was a different weight to her words. "Most do not leave," she said. The sentence lingered, unfinished but complete in its meaning, and Ethan understood enough to feel the edge of it, the line between what had happened and what could have happened, the difference marked not by intention but by choice. He exhaled slowly, the sound barely audible, and for the first time since she appeared, he shifted his attention slightly, glancing toward the small object still resting at the edge of the porch. "You left that," he said, not pointing, not moving toward it, simply acknowledging its presence as part of whatever this was becoming. Her eyes followed his for the briefest moment before returning to him, and something in her expression changed, not softened, but clarified, as if the purpose of her being there had finally found its place. "It means you were seen," she said. The words carried no threat, no warning of harm, but they settled heavier than either could have, because being seen in this land, in this way, was not a simple thing. Ethan absorbed that in silence, letting it settle where it would, because he knew better than to answer too quickly, knew that understanding here did not come from speaking first. A faint breeze stirred then, just enough to move the edge of his coat, just enough to remind him that the world had not stopped entirely, and yet the moment held, stretched, thin but unbroken. "What happens now?" he asked finally, the question simple, direct, not demanding an answer but offering space for one. She did not respond right away, and in that pause Ethan felt something shift again, something larger than the two of them, something beyond the cabin and the creek and the stretch of land he had called his own for years. When she did speak, her voice was quieter, but no less certain. "That depends on what you do with what you saw," she said, and the words did not end the moment. They opened it, leaving Ethan standing on the edge of something he had not chosen, but could no longer walk away from. The question did not hang in the air for long before the land itself seemed to answer first, not with words, but with a shift so subtle most men would have missed it, a tension pulling tight across the quiet like a rope drawn between unseen hands, and Ethan Cole felt it settle into his chest before he understood why. Nayeli did not turn her head, did not change her stance, but something in her eyes moved past him, beyond the porch, beyond the small circle of space they had carved out between them, and that was when Ethan noticed it too, not shapes, not figures, just the absence of emptiness where emptiness should have been. The ridge line to the east held shadows that did not belong to rock or brush, still forms set against the faint outline of the sky, and then another to the west, and another farther back where the ground dipped low, spaced wide, deliberate, not closing in, not rushing forward, simply present, as if the valley itself had grown watchful eyes. Ethan did not reach for his rifle, did not step back toward the door, because the way they stood out there made one thing clear. This was not about force, not yet, maybe not ever. This was about being seen, just as she had said. "You were not alone when you left," Naeli said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of something already decided long before he had returned to his cabin, and Ethan let out a slow breath, the truth of it settling into him without resistance. He nodded once, not to her, not to them, but to the moment itself, accepting it for what it was instead of what he wished it could be. "How many?" he asked, not because he needed the number, but because speaking kept him steady, kept the ground beneath him from shifting too far too fast. "Enough," she answered, and there was no fear in it, no urgency, only certainty, the kind that did not change with numbers. The wind stirred again, faint, carrying the scent of dust, and something older, something like leather warmed by sun, and Ethan understood then that this had been unfolding long before he ever stepped into the creek, that the land he thought he knew had always belonged to stories he had never been part of until now. He took one slow step forward, stopping at the edge of the porch, placing himself fully in the open, no walls at his back, no shadow to hide in, and the movement drew no reaction from the figures beyond the ridge, no shift, no advance. Only the same quiet attention, watching, waiting. Naeli's gaze returned to him, sharper now, searching for something he had not yet shown, something that mattered more than apology, more than explanation. Ethan glanced once more at the small cord lying on the wood beside him, the stone catching the faintest trace of starlight, and then back to her, his decision settling in the space between one breath and the next. He bent down slowly, careful in every movement, and picked it up for the first time, the cord rough against his fingers, the stone cool and heavier than it looked, as if it carried more than its weight in his hand. He did not examine it, did not question it. He simply held it, letting the act speak where words could not. Naeli watched him without blinking, and something in the distance shifted, not closer, not farther, but changed, like a held breath finally released. "You understand," she said, and this time it was not a question. Ethan met her eyes, steady, grounded, and answered in the only way that mattered, not with explanation, but with presence. "I will not carry it wrong," he said quietly, and the words settled into the night. Simple, unadorned, but enough to move something unseen, enough to hold the line that had been drawn without his knowing. The figures beyond the ridge did not disappear, did not step forward. They remained, silent as the land itself, but the weight of them shifted, no longer pressing in, no longer closing around him, and Ethan understood then that whatever came next would not be decided by numbers, or distance, or fear, but by what he chose to do when the silence ended. The night held its shape, but the meaning inside it shifted, quieter now, heavier in a different way, and Ethan Cole felt it settle into his bones as he stood there with the cord in his hand, the small stone resting against his palm like something that had already chosen him before he ever touched it. The figures along the ridge did not move, but their stillness no longer pressed forward. It waited, and waiting carried its own kind of weight. Naeli took a slow breath, her shoulders rising just enough to catch the starlight before settling again. And when she spoke, her voice carried farther than before, not louder, but clearer, as if the words were meant for more than just him. "They will not come closer tonight," she said, and Ethan understood that the promise was not safety, it was time. Time for what? He asked, his tone even, because questions felt steadier than silence when the ground beneath a man began to shift. She turned her head slightly, just enough that he could see the line of her profile, the calm in it, the resolve that did not belong to someone uncertain. "For you to choose," she said, and the words settled deeper than anything else she had spoken. Ethan glanced once toward the ridge again, the faint outline still there, spaced wide across the land like markers set long ago, and then back to her, his mind moving through the meaning of it, not fast, not slow, but steady, the way a man measured distance when the path ahead was not marked. "I already did," he said, lifting the cord slightly, not as proof, not as defense, just as truth. Naeli's eyes followed the motion, and for a moment something softer passed through them, not weakness, not relief, but recognition, as if she had been waiting to see whether he understood what that small act meant beyond itself. That was the first step, she said, and the way she said it made clear there were more steps ahead, ones he had not yet seen. The air shifted again, a faint breeze moving across the open ground, brushing past him and carrying with it the quiet presence of those watching from the ridge, and Ethan realized then that whatever this was, it was larger than a single moment, larger than the creek, larger than the line he had crossed without knowing. What happens if I choose wrong? He asked, not because he feared the answer, but because he needed to hear how she would shape it. Naeli did not answer right away, and in that pause the night seemed to lean closer again, not pressing, not threatening, just listening. When she spoke, her voice was lower, but it carried the kind of certainty that did not come from guessing. Then it will not be wrong only for you, she said, and the meaning settled without explanation, spreading outward beyond him, beyond her, into the land itself. Ethan absorbed that in silence, letting it take its place beside everything else, because he understood now that this was not about a single choice. It was about what that choice would carry into the world around them. He looked at her again, really looked this time, not as a stranger at the edge of a creek, not as someone caught in a moment that did not belong to him, but as someone standing at the center of something he had just stepped into, something that had rules he did not yet know but could feel all the same. You came here to tell me this, he said quietly, and it was not a question. Naeli held his gaze, steady, unbroken, and after a moment she gave the slightest nod. I came so you would not choose blind, she said, and the words carried something unexpected, not warning, not judgment, but a kind of respect that had not been there before. The figures along the ridge remained, silent and distant, but no longer uncertain, and Ethan understood then that the night was not asking anything more of him now, not yet, that the next step would come with the light, and what he did when the sun rose would matter more than anything he could say in the dark. The first light came slow across the land, not in a rush but in a quiet reveal, turning the horizon pale before touching the ground, and Ethan Cole had not slept, not even for a minute. Standing through the long hours as the night thinned and the shapes along the ridge faded back into the earth that held them. Naeli had not left, not fully. She had moved only a few steps back before the darkness took her shape away, but he knew she was still there somewhere beyond sight, waiting the same way the others had waited, not for fear, not for chance, but for a choice that daylight would make real. When the sun finally broke over the ridge, it did not bring relief. It brought clarity, the kind that stripped a man of excuses and left only what he was willing to stand by. Ethan stepped off the porch and into the open ground, the dust cool beneath his boots, the cord still wrapped loosely around his fingers, the small stone resting against his palm as if it had always belonged there. He did not reach for his rifle, did not even glance toward it, leaving it where it leaned against the wall, because some things could not be carried into this moment without breaking it. The valley stretched wide around him, empty to the eye now, the watchers gone or hidden, so while they might as well have been part of the land itself again, but the absence of them did not mean they were gone. It only meant they were giving him space to be seen clearly. Ethan walked a few steps forward, stopping where the porch no longer touched his back, where there was nothing behind him but open air, and he stood there, letting the morning settle around him, the faint warmth of the sun touching his shoulders, the quiet returning in a different shape than it had the night before. He looked toward the ridge where he had first noticed the shadows, then toward the creek beyond it, the place where everything had begun, and for a moment he closed his eyes, not in hesitation, but in acknowledgement, as if marking the line he was about to cross with full awareness of what it meant. When he opened them again, she was there, not emerging, not approaching, simply present once more at the edge of distance, her figure outlined in the soft light of morning, as still as she had been in the water, as certain as the ground beneath them both. Ethan did not wait for her to speak this time, because the night had already said what needed to be said, and he understood now that what mattered was not explanation, but action. He lowered his gaze briefly to the cord in his hand, then lifted it slightly, not as an offering, not as a return, but as something accepted, something he would carry the way it was meant to be carried. Then he did the one thing that would decide everything that followed. He took his hat from his head and set it down on the ground beside him, a small gesture, easy to miss if a man did not understand what it meant, but out here, where nothing was done without reason, it spoke louder than any words could. No claim, No defense. No distance. Just a man standing as himself. Naeli watched him, her eyes steady, searching not for strength, not for defiance, but for truth. And for the first time since the creek, something in her expression shifted, not softened, not broken, but opened, as if the path in front of them had finally become visible. "You choose to stand without it," she said, her voice carrying across the space between them, and Ethan gave a small nod, the movement simple, certain. "I choose to stand right," he answered, and the words did not echo, did not carry far, but they settled exactly where they needed to, in the space between what he had done and what he would become because of it. And somewhere beyond the ridge, unseen but no longer distant, the land itself seemed to accept that answer in silence. The morning did not rush forward after that. It lingered, as if even the sun understood that something fragile stood between two worlds and should not be pushed too quickly. And Ethan Cole remained where he was, hat resting on the ground beside him, the cord still in his hand, the weight of both choices settling into the quiet space around him. Naeli did not move at first, her gaze holding his, measuring not his words but the stillness behind them, the absence of fear, the absence of claim, and in that absence she seemed to find what she had come for, though it did not bring ease to her face, only a deeper kind of certainty. The land stayed silent, no riders breaking the horizon, no voices calling out. But Ethan felt it again, that unseen presence along the ridge, not pressing, not watching in the same way as before, but waiting for what would come next, waiting for her. She took a step forward, slow and deliberate, closing some of the distance between them, and for the first time the space did not feel like a boundary, it felt like something being crossed with care. "You stood as you said," she spoke, her voice carrying softer now, not because it lacked strength, but because it no longer needed to prove it, and Ethan gave a slight nod, not shifting his stance, not reaching for anything, letting the moment remain as it was. "But standing right has a cost," she continued, and this time her eyes did not search him, they warned him, not of danger, but of truth, and Ethan felt that truth settle in before she even finished speaking. "If I do not return as I should," she said, the rest of the words unspoken but clear, "then what you saw becomes something else in their eyes, something that cannot remain where it is." Ethan looked at her carefully, not with confusion, but with understanding that came slowly, like light spreading across the land, and he saw it then, not just her, not just the moment at the creek, but the line she stood on, the place between her people and this choice she had made by coming here alone. "You cannot go back the same," he said quietly, not asking, not guessing, simply recognizing what had already begun to change. Naeli held his gaze for a long moment, and then she gave the smallest nod, the kind that carried more weight than any long explanation. "Not as I was," she said, and there was no regret in it, only acceptance. The breeze moved again, lifting a strand of her hair, carrying the scent of the open land between them, and Ethan glanced once toward the ridge, then back to her, the pieces of it settling into place in his mind, not as a problem to solve, but as something to stand with. He did not speak right away, because he knew now that words could not carry what this moment required, that whatever came next had to be shown, not explained. He looked down at the hat resting in the dust beside him, then back at her, and after a brief pause, he stepped back once, slow and steady, creating space where there had been none, not to distance himself, but to make room for something else. The gesture was small, easy to miss, but it changed the shape of the ground between them, turning it from a place of judgment into a place of choice. Then, without breaking eye contact, he turned slightly and stepped aside from the doorway of his cabin, leaving it open behind him, the dark interior visible in the morning light, simple, empty, his. He did not gesture, did not invite with words. He simply made the space available, the way a man offered water in the desert, without demand, without expectation. Naeli did not move immediately, but something in her expression shifted again, not uncertainty, not hesitation, but the recognition of what had just been placed before her, not as a solution, but as a path. The land remained quiet, the watchers unseen but no longer needed, and in that stillness, the choice that had begun at the creek finally reached its true weight, not in what had been taken, but in what was now being given. She stood there for a long moment, The doorway opened behind him. The space between them no longer a line, but something softer, something that could be crossed without breaking. And Ethan Cole did not move, did not speak, because he understood now that this was no longer his moment to shape. Naeli's eyes lingered on him, not searching, not questioning, but weighing something deeper than choice, something that had already begun to change the moment she stepped out of the creek and found him still standing where he should not have been. The wind moved lightly across the ground, lifting dust in thin lines that drifted past their boots, and the land around them held its silence, not empty, not waiting, but settled, as if whatever judgment had once been there had already passed. She took a step forward, then another, each one measured, each one certain, until she reached the edge of the porch where the shadow of the cabin met the morning light, and there she stopped, not crossing fully, not yet, her hand resting briefly against the rough wood as if feeling the boundary between what had been and what could be. Ethan remained still, giving her that space, not turning away, not stepping closer, because he knew now that respect was not in what he offered, but in what he did not take. The cord in his hand felt different now, no longer just a sign, but a weight he understood, and he lowered his hand slowly, letting it rest at his side, no longer needing to show it, because it had already been accepted. Naeli glanced once back toward the ridge, where nothing moved, where no figure stood visible against the sky, and yet both of them knew that the land still held those who had watched, those who had seen, those who would remember. When she turned back to him, there was no hesitation left in her, only a quiet resolve that did not need words to carry it forward. She stepped onto the porch, the wood creaking softly beneath her weight, and crossed the threshold without asking, without being asked, because the space had already been given before she moved. Inside, the cabin remained as it had always been, simple, unclaimed by anything but the life Ethan had kept small and contained, and for the first time since he had built it, it no longer felt like something meant for one man alone. He did not follow her immediately. Instead, he remained just outside, standing in the morning light, looking out over the land that had watched him for so long without ever touching his life, and now had changed it without a single sound. After a moment, he bent down and picked up his hat from the dust, brushing it once with his hand before settling it back onto his head, not as a return to what had been, but as a quiet acknowledgement that what he carried now was not the same. He stepped onto the porch and into the doorway, stopping just inside, leaving space between them once more, not as distance, but as respect that would not be broken even here. Naeli stood near the small window, the light catching the edge of her face, her gaze moving across the room, taking in every detail, not as a stranger entering a place, but as someone deciding whether it could hold what she had become. She did not speak, and neither did he, because there was nothing left to explain, nothing left to promise. The silence between them was no longer uncertain, no longer fragile. It was steady, grounded in something neither of them had named, but both of them understood. Outside, the wind moved again, softer now, carrying no warning, no weight, only the quiet rhythm of a land that had accepted what had been chosen. And inside that small cabin, without a word, without a claim, a home was given, not by ownership, not by right, but by something far rarer out here, something that did not need to be spoken to be true.